The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
Joining us today, we've got Dr. Mike Wood. Thank you for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
So here we are, Psychology of Conspiracy Theories. So is this a mental issue?
I guess you could say it's mostly a thing of the mind, and I think it's certainly an issue. So if you put those two words together, then technically, in the same way that, that way, if I say that somebody's, plotting to rob a bank, if some gang is getting together trying to rob a bank, that's a conspiracy theory. But mental issue, like conspiracy theory, is a phrase that's, more than the sum of its parts, And, spoiler alert, I don't have any silver bullets for you for conspiracy theories. So, yeah, sorry to disappoint you off the bat, but I think the research isn't there yet. We don't have a pill that you can take that makes you think that, JFK was killed by a lone gunman. We're working on it, but, Big Pharma is still a ways off on that one.
Well, we didn't land on the moon, right? So
maybe that's where they are, man. Maybe that's where the pills are. Just go mine them out of the moon rocks.
Is it a virus?
It's a virus that's made of cheese. If you believe in all that germ theory stuff, which I'm honestly not convinced of.
Isn't it? It's maybe in the flu shot. If I get the flu shot, not only do they track me, but they make it contagious. They make me believe in conspiracies.
Yeah, honestly, I think that the moon rocks and the microchips might kind of cancel each other out. Like they have opposite waveforms, and they just zero each other out. That might be
okay. So before we tell all of our fans that everything they think is true is actually true, why don't we get back to the psychology of conspiracy theories? So, Mike, when you think about the big psychological factors that drives these beliefs, what do you think those are? Like, what are the characteristics you would find in a person that just makes them want to believe all sorts of this wacky stuff?
So this is kind of interesting. We've had a lot of developments in the research on this. People have been looking at this for a few years, 20 years now, since like the first, I would say, big psychological study of this. We've learned a lot. We've learned that one of the things that's not so important probably is personality. It doesn't seem like there's a single personality factor that really reliably predicts somebody's belief in conspiracy theories. There are a few things that are important. Some of it has to do with the way that people tend to think about the world. Like if you are a sort of, very intuitive type of person, if you're kind of shoot from the hip, you go with your gut feelings, you tend to, not want to think about things too hard, and you just kind of get a general impression, you go with that, then you're probably more likely to be into more conspiracy theories than someone who's a little bit more, into sort of being very analytical about things and kind of breaking stuff down and thinking stuff through step by step very deliberately. So there's a thinking style aspect to it there. There's also certain characteristics of somebody's worldview. Are they a naturally sort of suspicious and mistrustful type of person? Obviously, if you don't trust people in general, then conspiracy theories are going to seem a little bit more plausible to you. There are things like, how much do you feel like you fit in with society, the people around you? Do you feel like your values are represented in society and that your values are reflected in the way that we run the world? And if not, then that's going to make you more alienated from the world. It gives rise to what we call the feeling of enemy, and that's kind of that's something that seems to have a role in driving conspiracy theories as well. So there are all these sort of situational type of things that can cause you to believe conspiracy theories or not in particular situations. And then, of course, it depends on the exact conspiracy theory itself. So some of it comes down to the content of it. So it's pretty complicated, and a lot of it is very situational, like a lot of psychology is.
So you did a really big paper, a research study called Dead and Alive. and it made a lot of waves. Can you tell us a little bit about what the finding was in that paper?
Yeah, so there was this very persistent finding that we saw in a lot of the early work on conspiracy theories, that one of the big things that you could look at to figure out if somebody believed any given conspiracy theory was what they thought of other conspiracy theories. So, if you have a big list of conspiracy theories and you ask people, how much do you believe that this one is true? How much do you believe that that one is true? You could ask people, do you think 9/11 was an inside job? Do you think the moon landing never happened? Do you think Princess Diana was killed by the British royal family? And so on. And if you look at people's answers to all of those, and then you try to predict what they think about vaccines from that, you're going to be pretty accurate. You're going to do a pretty good job. All of these things tend to correlate with each other, right? So the more somebody is suspicious about one thing, the more they tend to be suspicious about other things. It's clear enough. So what my co-author Karen Douglas and I, Karen was my PhD supervisor at the time, what we were interested in was, well, what if we looked at different conspiracy theories about the same thing? So not all, there's no one 9/11 conspiracy theory. There's no one JFK conspiracy theory. And the same thing goes for the death of Princess Diana, which is a big thing in the UK, which was where this study was done. And so we had this data set where we had asked about a couple of these conspiracy theories. So, maybe she was killed by the British royal family. Maybe she was killed by her boyfriend's father's business enemies. Maybe she faked her own death. We asked about a few of these things, and we found that there were actually positive correlations between them. So the higher somebody's responses to the faked her own death conspiracy theory, the higher their responses tended to be to the other conspiracy theories as well, which is, it looks like it could be some kind of a contradiction, right? Because obviously she can't be dead and alive. She can't have faked her own death and have been killed by this one person and have been killed by the other person. It's not possible. And then we did another study where we looked at conspiracy theories about the death of Osama bin Laden, which had just happened at the time. And, there were some that he was, he had been dead since like 2002 and, died of kidney disease. And they were like weekend at Bernie'sing him. And then there was another one that was another conspiracy theory that said, well, they didn't kill him in the raid. That's why there were no pics. They actually captured him and, they black bagged him and took him off to Gitmo. And they're interrogating him there, and they just don't want people to know that he's alive. There were a few of these. And again, it was this thing, is he dead or is he still alive? Or, was he dead long ago or is he still alive? And we found the same thing, that the higher people's responses to the already dead conspiracy theory, the higher their responses to the still alive conspiracy theory. And this is just because, people get suspicious. And this is one of the things that I've kind of talked about in my research since then, is that conspiracy theories are not really theories a lot of the time. They're more like general suspicions that people have about a situation. And they think something's up, they think they're not being told the whole truth, that something's being covered up. And these individual little theories that kind of bubble up to the surface, that say that, oh yeah, Diana was killed by Queen Elizabeth. That's not really what it's about. It's about being suspicious. And so that suspicion can drive a lot of different conspiracy theories that sometimes contradict each other. And usually people aren't super sure about it. What we saw wasn't that people were like, yeah, she's definitely still alive and she was definitely killed by the royal family. They would say something like, both of those are pretty believable. And so they wouldn't be super sure about it. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you said you got people who were like, no, that's all crap. None of that happened. And she died in a car accident and bin Laden was killed in the raid. So that's where this seems to come from. And I think that it points to this kind of vagueness at the heart of a lot of conspiracy theories, because they're not about the specific theory. They're about the mistrust and about the suspicion. And that's what's really at the heart of it.
So I tend to find that in surveys too. So, for example, when you ask people, do you think there was a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy? You'll get 60% of people saying yes. And what's interesting is you would think that all those people have some specific theory that they're speaking to, that they've been convinced of some specific thing, they have real evidence for it, and so they have a reason. But what we tend to find is most people will say there's a conspiracy and they don't know what it is or what happened. And it's just a rejection of the official story rather than it is, I have a real reason to believe some other thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, another thing that I found in a follow-up study was if you look at the way that people argue about 9/11 conspiracy theories online, you can go and look at what we did was we looked at comment sections of news websites around the 10th anniversary of 9/11 and looked at how people were talking about these theories and how people were arguing for them and how they were arguing against them. And the people who were arguing against the conspiracy theories would usually say, well, no, the official sort of mainstream story of 9/11 is actually really plausible. These things that are supposedly wrong with it are actually not problems at all. This is perfectly explainable and so on. And then the people who were sort of advocating for the conspiracy theories would say, well, no, the official story doesn't make sense at all. Look at this, look at the, Building 7, look at the stand down order that Cheney gave on the day, and all of these things. And it was quite rare for anyone to actually talk directly about the conspiracy theories and say, no, only this conspiracy theory can explain these facts, And so arguing in favor of a specific theory, or even on the sort of mainstream supporters side, arguing against a specific conspiracy theory, that wasn't really a thing because there was no kind of official conspiracy theory. And in a way there can't be. So it's a hard thing to get a grip on, for sure.
So Al can attest to this too, because we've had a lot of guests on this show that will come in and they want to dance around their conspiracy theory, and rather than say, I think A, B, and C happened, they'll say, well, I'm just asking questions, or I'm just throwing out facts that, suggest that the official story might not be entirely true. When in fact, they probably believe something, they're convinced of something, they may not want to say it out loud, and maybe they don't even know fully what it is, but they're convinced that something's not right.
Yeah, and it's, to some extent I'm sympathetic to that because it is hard to make, like if you commit yourself to something and you turn out to be wrong, but then you think, well, there's still something here, maybe there's still something right about this. That's got to feel pretty bad, right? And I think, in the 9/11 truth movement, if you look at kind of the internal politics of it and the way that people talk about it, there are people who try to make, they give it the old college try. They come up with, here's what happened, here's the timeline. And then people go absolutely berserk over this. There's a lot of infighting. There's a big, or I don't know if this is still going on, but it used to be that there was a big debate about whether the planes were real or not, like the no plane 9/11 truthers versus the other people. And then everyone's kind of accusing each other of being part of the conspiracy. And this kind of is what happens, I think, to some extent when you stick your neck out and say this is exactly what's going on. You're kind of making yourself vulnerable to people who are maybe otherwise sympathetic to you, and to the people who, you're giving ammunition to people who would want to argue against you for any reason, I guess. And so there's like a fairly cynical reason like that, not to go into detail, but also I think it speaks to this psychological characteristic of conspiracy theories, which is that they're really about suspicion and doubt and about being opposed to a particular explanation rather than in favor of another one.
Well, sometimes I find that people have a clear idea of what they want to say, but they know better than to say it out loud. And that's when you get into this I'm just asking questions business, where it's just sort of, well, I'm not asserting that, President Bush killed 3,000 of his own people on 9/11. I'm just asking questions. I'm doing, a social good. And I'm not saying it's not necessarily a social good, but it seems like people will sometimes have a strong idea and just not want to share it. Maybe, as you say, because they don't want the idea to be, taken apart once it's said out loud. And maybe they just don't want to face the blowback that conspiracy theorists often face.
Yeah, I wonder also if it's like it's kind of a Socratic thing to some extent, right? Like, I think that people, when they're, this was kind of one of the ideas that we had with this online comments study, was that, people are going to try to persuade others in the way that they think would be effective on them, right? Like, so would I find this convincing? How would I want to be red-pilled on, 9/11 or whatever. And people have this thought, well, I would want somebody to, engage me in this conversation and have me kind of figure it out for myself and ask these sort of questions and kind of lead me down the garden path rather than just spouting facts at me. And I think that can be quite effective. If you look at something like QAnon, for instance, QAnon is all based on these kind of little puzzles. All of QAnon's early posts were these sort of questions like, who controls North Korea? Who really controls North Korea? And it's this way of kind of engaging the person. And it's like QAnon, it's like he's giving them the junior jumble, It's like this sort of Da Vinci Code type of thing where people are figuring out a puzzle. And I think that people enjoy that to some extent, and it's kind of effective. And so I can't fault it on that basis. But I think that it can be used to conceal a sort of, not intellectual dishonesty, but intellectual vagueness or sometimes laziness, where people don't always think their ideas all the way through.
So bringing up the QAnon, I mean, we've talked about that on this show quite a few times. One thing that's interesting with it, and I want to get your thoughts, is that these QAnon people, as dark as the conspiracy theory is that they believe them, that there's this satanic deep state and that pretty much every politician in the country is a satanic sex trafficker and they eat babies for the magic powers. I mean, that's a dark vision of the world, but there's something very hopeful that's attached to it, and that there's going to be this great awakening and the wrongdoers will be brought to justice and summarily hung at Guantanamo Bay. And then there's going to be a new reality where everyone's going to be happy and the world's going to be this great utopia after this awakening occurs. Do you see that often? Like, is there a need to either, one, have this dark view or to have sort of a hopeful view at the same time?
Yeah, so there's, this is something that has been noted in a lot of these conspiracy beliefs, is that there's a Manichaeanism, this sort of black and white, good and evil thinking, where the world is a struggle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and then, sooner or later, one or the other of them is going to triumph, right? And it's, of course, going to be good. And, QAnon is especially interesting about this because it's very much in the sort of American Protestant tradition of these sort of small millennial groups, like the groups that are essentially waiting for the apocalypse and looking at prophecies of the apocalypse. And there's going to be this great reckoning, and there's going to be a cleansing, and then we're going to have an age of peace and prosperity, and all the wrongdoers will be sent to justice, and Satan will be cast into the lake of fire, and then Jesus will come back and rule for 1,000 years. This is exactly what QAnon is. It's in every way, there's a great tradition of studies of American new religious movements or cults or sects or whatever you want to call them that are waiting for the apocalypse. And especially ones that have specific prophecies of when and how this is going to happen. And they have this whole system of, what happens when you set a date when everything's going to go down and it doesn't come. How do your followers react? What does the prophet do? I mean, this is not just the States. You see this all around the world. There have been examples everywhere, from Kenya to Japan to Quebec, right? There's loads of them. But this is the thing. All of these have this same kind of core to them, where there are these forces of evil. The world is almost irredeemably corrupt, but there's this great cleansing coming. And, we've got this message for you, the faithful. We're giving you a heads up that this is all going to happen. So you have to prepare yourselves. You have to make sure that you're good and righteous. And then when the time comes, all the evil is going to be swept away. And, it's no surprise to some extent that QAnon has found traction in these sorts of sections of the population that have exposure to these things. Because if you read Left Behind, if you read Hal Lindsey, if you read, any of these sort of premillennial dispensationalist sort of, end times Christianity things, it's very similar in terms of its themes and how it's all supposed to go down. So there's a lot of history behind QAnon, and I think whoever's doing it is pretty savvy about that.
So one thing that interests me, you brought up QAnon. Is this a cult? I mean, it's almost cultish. It's sort of a weird setup in that the people they don't have a meeting place or a church or a temple or anything, but they sort of follow the same Twitter accounts and they follow the same YouTube channels, and they all in sort of a hierarchical fashion, they're following this Q poster, whoever it might be. But is it sort of like the modern internet version of a cult?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. There's no definition of cult. Like, I don't think actual, like, religious scholars use the term cult. It's kind of an informal thing. So, you can't really say if it's a cult or not. But I think it has a lot of the characteristics of what they call new religious movements, which is kind of an umbrella term for things that you might call cults, but also some other stuff. But yeah, it has a sort of very specific and kind of unconventional worldview. It has certainly a very apocalyptic worldview, not in the sense that the world's going to end, but there's going to be this dramatic. It's the end of the world as we know it, I guess. When they send Hillary off to Gitmo. That's when everything changes, right? And yeah, it has a lot of the same characteristics for sure.
So the news out of the QAnon camp today, because they've had this I'll call it prophecy. It was their prophecy or prediction that all of Trump's enemies, including the Clintons and all the other satanic sex traffickers, would be rounded up, and there were already secret indictments, 500 secret indictments for their arrest. And obviously none of these people have been arrested. There's no perp walks. No one's been jailed or sent to Gitmo. But what some of the top Q people said today is that they've all already been arrested in secret, and they've already signed guilty pleas. So now they've decided to cooperate, and we're just waiting for the point, once they've finished the true investigation of the deep state. At that point, Hillary Clinton will be sent down to Gitmo to serve, I guess, a lighter sentence for her satanic sex trafficking.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of. I think that this has been said before in QAnon. It's certainly a pretty old tactic. I've been reading up on this more and more because I've been so interested in how new religious movements justify failed prophecies, and there's like this There's kind of three ways that they can do it if they predict something is going to happen and then it doesn't. Usually, the end of the world or some big event. And this is exactly like the first one, which is claim that the prophecy was fulfilled just invisibly. So, do you remember Harold Camping?
Yes.
So, yeah, for anyone who doesn't remember, Harold Camping was this like radio evangelist guy who said that the rapture was going to happen on some certain date, right? Date comes and goes, nothing happens. And then he says, well, we miscalculated. It's actually going to be at this other date. So that's sort of number one in ways to justify a failed prophecy. We screwed up. It's actually a different date. So then the other date comes, and he does tactic number two, which is that it was fulfilled but invisibly. So he says, well, there was an invisible rapture. God's passed his judgment on the world. He just didn't tell anybody about it. So the world's going to end properly any day now. It's started, but nobody can see it. And that's exactly what happens with Q. Now, the third thing that the way that a lot of these prophets will justify failed prophecies is to say, well, it was foiled. We were going to do it. We were going to bring about the end of the world, but the enemy did something, and it delayed things a little bit. It's still coming. It's just delayed. And Q's done an interesting inversion of that, which is he has this quote from way back called "disinformation is necessary." And what Q uses that to mean is that, well, I was lying when I said that it was all going to happen, but that was just to make the bad guys panic and make them, go around and start, shredding documents or doing whatever. And we totally psyched him out, and we're going to get him next time. And then he does this over and over and over, and he does all of these prophecies, and every time he just says, "Oh yeah, this prophecy served its purpose. They used up some of their ammunition." And at some point, it just becomes like Charlie Brown trying to kick the football, and Lucy is always just yanking it away at the last minute. And I really would have thought the deep state would have caught on to this by now, if I'm honest.
Yeah, it is sort of strange that the prophecies continue to never come true. But there's always this issue where, there's a reason for it. And it's sort of strange that you have the Q character always putting out these little messages, and it doesn't make sense that he would say, oh yeah, we were using disinformation against the deep state. First of all, I don't know that there's a deep state. I don't know why they would be following this Q account, first of all. It's just sort of this delusion of grandeur that, there's this battle between good and evil taking place, and it's all taking place on 8chan.
Well, not entirely on 8chan, because all the bad guys send their messages through James Comey's Twitter account.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So you bring that up. Let me ask you a question. So some of this can do real damage because, speaking of James Comey's Twitter account, he put out a tweet where it was sort of innocuous, I think, something about it just had some letters in it, and then people scrambled the letters to turn it into the name of a school, and then decided there was going to be some sort of terrorist attack at a school bake sale, and then they threatened the school, and the school had to shut down the bake sale. So, I mean, do you see lots of damage like that coming from this sort of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's not the first time that something like this has happened. If you remember the Boston Marathon bombing, there was a bunch of sort of amateur sleuthing that was happening online around that time, especially on Reddit and sites like that, where people were trying to figure out, there were these sort of, I think the police actually released a bunch of surveillance video, and they said, look at this, and if you can find anything, we'd appreciate the help, basically. They tried to crowdsource some of the investigation. People started combing through it, and they identified what they thought was the bomber, and they're like, oh yeah, it's totally this guy. And it turned out it was some dude who had gone missing like a week before, and he'd actually committed suicide or something like that. And his family got harassed and stuff. It was a bad scene, and these rumors just went all over the place. And I think some people still are, think that, it was actually him, and they killed him to cover it up or something like that. And it ended up having this blowback. And this happens a lot when you have these sorts of just general conspiracy rumor mills, but especially among communities that kind of fancy themselves citizen investigators or, distributed sleuthing or whatever you want to call it. That, once there's some piece of bad information out there, it never goes away. There's no quality control in investigations like this. And, we see this over and over for sure.
So one thing that I've been thinking about a little bit, particularly with QAnon, but with some other, sort of conspiracy-ish things out there too lately, is that there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, if we see the QAnon and they're saying there's all these, satanic sex traffickers out there, and they control the government. Well, if you go back to Oliver Stone's JFK, it's a bunch of pedophiles who conspired within the deep state to kill Kennedy. If you go back a few years before that, people thought Dungeons and Dragons was part of some satanic thing to get all the kids to kill themselves, and there were Satanists running around everywhere taking over police departments and whatnot. And they actually wound up putting people in jail in the U.S. for phony crimes, a lot of these things. So, I mean, when does it go from just psychology, being something internal to people, to being something where you have groups of people falling victim to these sort of delusions?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. Like, I think conspiracy theories are almost always going to be a social thing. I think they're inevitably social because they're always about the idea of groups kind of moving and plotting against one another. If there's no conspiracy by one person against one person, that's just somebody with like a vendetta or something like that, right? Conspiracy theories are always about like in psychology, we do talk about, delusions of persecution and paranoia and things like that. And the difference between that and a conspiracy theory is that a delusion of persecution is always about a single person. They're out to get me. And conspiracy theories are not like that. They're about, they're out to get us. And there's always some sort of sense of common fate or like a sense of brotherhood almost about conspiracy theories. And they're always a social phenomenon. So there's the internal psychology that, might make somebody more or less likely to buy into a conspiracy theory or to see a conspiracy in something. But when that gets translated into action and how that spreads between people, that's kind of a different question. And in many ways, it's sort of a more interesting one, about what happens when we go beyond the realm of the individual and turn it into a question of how people relate to one another.
Yeah, it is interesting. And then when you add in the element of the internet, with it too, which isn't necessary, but I think it sort of accelerates the spreading of some of these ideas. For example, you have these fears of sex trafficking. And yes, sex trafficking does exist in the world, but the fear of it has gotten so overblown in the country that they're passing a lot of policies that seem very much unnecessary. And at the same time, you have, police departments warning people, if you go to the store, watch out in the parking lot because they're just snatching people right out of the parking lot and selling them into sex slavery. And it's like, these are all sort of urban myths that just get started on Facebook and they travel around and people think it's true, but it's not. And it just builds this idea that, you can't even go to the store because there's sex traffickers just waiting to steal you.
Yeah, for sure. And that feeling of being under threat, it's almost a siege mentality. I think that's what a lot of conspiracy theories have to them, is this kind of idea of a siege mentality. I think that can be really damaging, and especially when it's so out of proportion to the actual threat. I guess the silver lining, if there is one, is that a lot of the time these people who are implicated in this are kind of faceless. It's them. They're out to get you. Some sex traffickers are going to come and snatch you, and that's whatever. It's a fear of some kind of general impersonal force. But when you start putting names and faces to that, and when you start saying, it's the deep state, it's the Muslims, and they're going to come take your kids, it's the Mexicans, that's when things start getting a little darker. And that's I don't know to what extent that's true of sex trafficking rumors right now. Do you have more of a sense of that?
Well, it's widespread, but I will tell you one example. There was a group of armed men who were running around the Tucson desert looking for these satanic sex traffickers who were bringing
Operation Backyard Brawl. I know.
Yeah, bringing them in from Mexico, and it's just like, I just hope they don't find some innocent schlep walking across the desert and then say, oh, you're a satanic sex trafficker. But these guys had all sorts of stuff in their mind. Like they would find a tree stump and say, oh, well, this is a satanic altar where they were sacrificing the kids to the goat god or something. And it's just like they'd call the police. The police like, no, it's a tree stump. What do you guys are just coming up with fantasy stuff here. But I think if you get a bunch of people together and they're all sort of convinced of the same thing, they can wind up perhaps polarizing themselves by just all agreeing, and the ideas get more and more extreme, and there's no one to sort of pull them out. Of it. So when you're doing your work, what do you have in the back of your mind that there could be serious dangers to some of these beliefs, and does that sort of drive you sometimes?
Yeah. There are some that are clearly more actively damaging than others. If somebody wants to believe the Earth is flat, then I think that's a very stupid thing to believe, and I probably have little respect for that person. But I don't think that they're going to, I don't think that belief on its own is particularly harmful. I think it's just super dumb. If somebody thinks that vaccines are poison and they will never get their kids vaccinated and they're going to tell all their friends to do the same thing, or if they think that climate change is a hoax and it's their patriotic duty to roll coal on the 4th of July and just blast smoke all over the neighborhood, and just put as much carbon out there as possible and burn all their tires, then we're getting into the realms of, oh, this could be really bad, And yeah, there are some of those things that I look at and I'm like, oh crap, this is, I think that some of this stuff is really hard to deal with because it's rooted in some sense in an opposition to or a fear of or an uneasiness about collective action, which is what a lot of these problems require. If you want to get herd immunity to some disease, you want to eradicate polio or you want to eradicate measles, everybody's got to get vaccinated. If you want to, lower our carbon emissions to a point where we're only going to have 1.5 degrees of warming, then, that's going to be difficult, and we're all going to have to kind of pitch in on that. And that's the sort of thing where people kind of look at that and they go, what are you trying to pull here? What are you trying to do? And there's this this uneasiness about it that kind of comes out of that. And it's those problems that are the most difficult. And I think those are the conspiracy theories that we need to worry about the most, because that's, even if 10% of the population says, no, I'm never getting vaccinated, that's enough to wreck a lot of these efforts around things like disease eradication. and things like that. So yeah, I think that's where the biggest problems are for sure.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, this year now, and we're only halfway through, I think has more cases of measles in the U.S. than any year in the past, I think they said 25 years. So it's sort of been blowing up, and a lot of it is really just traced to people not getting vaccinated. And some of the justifications you see, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this. I mean, some people say, well, the vaccines are bad for you, but other people say, well, measles are actually good for you, and it's just a part of nature, and, you know, you're better off with it. So it seems like there's some really delusional reasoning taking place to people justifying the behavior.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm always like a little wary of sticking the label delusional on it, but it definitely does not seem good. Like I'm comfortable with that label. Not good. Let's use that one.
Well, don't forget the right part there. There's a lot of people that think that when you're getting the flu shot, they're putting in tracers to track you.
Yeah, I think that one's less common. I mean, the polls out there, I think most people have kind of got the health concern aspect to it, or you know, to some people it might just be like, look, who are you to tell me what to put in my body? You know, this is none of your business, and it's almost like just like a reactance thing. Like, no, I don't want it, and. You know, I got some sympathy for that. You know, I remember not wanting to put my jacket on when I was a kid or something like that. You know, but and I don't want to minimize it by saying that this is like a kid not wanting to put in their jacket. You know, people have concerns about bodily autonomy. That's justified. But yeah, the idea that it's always going to be, you know, more natural and better to do something a certain way. It's this just general sort of idea people have that, well, you know, we've gone astray, the world is crap, and a lot of that is because we're doing all these artificial things that are out there, and we're doing all these nasty chemicals and whatnot, and let's do it the natural way. And then, of course, you know, if you look back a few centuries, doing disease control and medicine the natural way ended up killing off a third of Europe, so that didn't work super well, if you ask me. But that's still, you know, it's still, these beliefs are out there, and they're kind of fallacious, and we got to try to, you know, remedy that wherever we can.
So I was never an anti-vaxxer. I always had all my vaccines. But, you know, one that you don't have to get is the flu shot. And I always thought, you know, oh, maybe they are sticking a chip in me or something like that. And I didn't quite understand vaccine science. So it wasn't until I got the flu, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that I said, I'm not doing this again. I'm getting the flu shot, and I get it religiously every year. And I barely get sick anymore. But it's like, it always makes me wonder if people say, oh yeah, catching the flu is good. And it's just trying to get into that mindset where the measles is good, catching the flu is good. It's almost like somebody saying, oh yeah, falling down and breaking your leg is good, so your leg learns how to heal itself. It just doesn't sound good to me. And it sounds like people are just stretching to try to justify their conspiracy beliefs.
Yeah, I wonder about some of that. You know, there's also stuff like radiation hormesis, where people think that getting small amounts of radiation is going to be good for you. That's like a weird sort of fringe health belief that's out there. I don't know. I mean, maybe there's something about this idea that, you know, suffering is virtuous, and that if you suffer, that makes you stronger. You know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? And, you know, there is some truth to some of this. Like, this is part of the basis for vaccines, is that if you get, like, the original smallpox vaccine, if you get this less severe disease, cowpox, then that's going to, you know, your immune system's going to learn to deal with that, and then you won't get the smallpox, you know. So this idea, I guess, that you know, if you've suffered, then you've earned your immunity, and if you get it from some other way, some vaccine, that's like cheating. You know, maybe it's something like that.
Yeah. Well, Al, what do you think?
I'm hiding. You've scared me.
Don't leave the house, Al.
Well, you know what? I don't understand, because I deal with these flat earthers and all these different general throughout interviews, and I don't understand the passion for it. It's one thing to say, well, I'm asking the question, and it's also one thing to say that, you know, it's not as bad if they're just flat earthers. It's not hurting anybody. but I find that most of them all have kind of grouped together. And it's quite passionate. They will scream at you, or they'll accuse you of things and attack you if you have any resistance to what they're saying.
Yeah. I mean, I got some sympathy for that, to be honest. Like, what if you were the only person in the world who knew that the Earth was round, right? And everybody else was going about their business being like, yeah, the Earth is flat. I would find that frustrating, personally. I would be like, you people, what the hell is wrong with you? Can't you see we're living on a globe? You know? I think that a lot of this is kind of just how people would react normally in this situation. Like, if it's like, no, you don't understand, don't get your baby's vaccines because they're going to track them and, you know, it's poisoning them. Like, I think that given how catastrophic some of these beliefs are about what is supposed to be going on, I think the weirder situation is when you have somebody who's like, yeah, you know, vaccines are poison and the Illuminati are going to put everybody in concentration camps, but, you know, it's just another day at the office, right?
Yeah, but you know, the information that they're getting, it's just not very sourced. How can you believe the world is flat, for instance, without any good information telling you that?
Yeah, I mean, probably what the flat earther would say would be that, you know, you can believe the evidence of your own eyes, and you can look out at the horizon. You can see that the Earth is flat, and who are you going to believe, your eyes or some egghead scientist who's just, you know, telling you something different, right? And I think this kind of comes back to what I said earlier about intuition, and that for a lot of people who get deep into these conspiracy theories, they just have a very intuitive way of thinking about things, and they go out and they look and they say, well, yeah, obviously the Earth is flat. It looks flat. What are you talking about, telling me that it's round? Am I on a spinning ball? Why don't I fly off into space? And you get all these things that are like kind of intuitive objections that don't really make a lot of sense if you look at them long enough. But they're kind of based in this intuition that, like, no, you're crazy. What are you talking about?
Well, yeah, but when you look at the moon, a full moon from North America, then you look at it from someone in Australia, it's upside down. They can't explain that.
I think they can. I don't know. I think what
their response is that there was no Australia.
Well, there's no Finland either, so.
Well, this is the thing. It's the vagueness, because this is the problem with, like, the flat earthers are a great example of this, especially like this idea of just saying, no, the world's not a globe. It's not a spinning ball in space. That's ridiculous. We'd all fall off. The oceans would fly away, you know. But there's no model of the flat Earth that makes any lick of sense. I don't think anybody's devised it. Like, you see the disk with this, you know, the sun and moon kind of spiraling around on top of it, and the seasons don't make sense in that. You can't have seasons and daylight on that map at the same time. There's no way to make that work that makes any kind of visual sense if you look at it. I mean, obviously the whole thing's got a lot of problems, but this is the thing. Like, there's always some ad hoc explanation. You can always come up with something on the spot and say, well, it's because the luminiferous ether from the firmament, you know, has some interesting optical properties and it flips things around sometimes. And it's this very sort of shoot from the hip, slapdash intuitive way of looking at it, where you kind of make these things up and say, oh yeah, you know, if we, like that Flat Earth documentary on Netflix where they got the laser gyroscope and were like, well, if the Earth is rotating, then this should show a 15 degree per hour drift, and it shows a 15 degree per hour drift, and they're like, obviously this is energy from the heavens doing this, so we have to encase it in a container made entirely from bismuth.
Well, there's always a way out when you don't get what you want, right?
Yeah.
But I think that's the point. I think that, for me, when they can't explain something, they create an answer, and there's no evidence to that. And that's where the problem lies.
Yeah, and that's kind of the difference between a lot of these sort of sciencey type models that you see kind of bouncing around in Flat Earth, and in also, you know, other conspiracy theory domains. You see a lot of alternative cosmologies out there, you know, ways people say that, you know, physics doesn't work the way we think it does, and gravity doesn't exist, and everything's just electromagnetism. And a lot of these models are just kind of like, this is magnets, you know. And if you actually like try to dig down into the fine detail, there's not a whole lot there, which is understandable, because if you try to put something there, it doesn't work, because the whole enterprise is doomed because it's nonsense. And I think that kind of winnows out the people who try to do that, and then the ones who are left believing in these same models are the ones who don't really bother to look that deeply into the nitty-gritty of it.
Well, so now, do you have a website or some sort of Facebook or something that you could let people know about, and then they can come see you, or do you just hide out?
I'm not super active on Twitter, but I do post on there sometimes. So if you want, you can follow me on Twitter at disinfoagent. That's DISINFO agent.
That's well. We're going to get a lot of emails for this, Al. So
yeah. Now, do you get a lot of that, Mike? Do you get a lot of that where people call you, or they think that you're working for the government or some sort of thing?
So it's kind of variable. A lot of people seem to think that I'm kind of well-meaning, but I've never really looked at Building 7 or something like that. You know, they're like, you know, this is your paper was interesting, but have you considered that we're actually right about everything? Here, watch this, 5-hour YouTube video. And mostly people are pretty civil. And then some people, like I just got, some handwritten 10-page letter from some guy telling me about like the Catholic Church or something like that. And then, every so often I do get people contacting me and saying, how dare you, you're working for them. But I think for the most part, people have actually been surprisingly civil. But, maybe after this comes out, that'll change. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, it sort of surprised me. We just had I don't know what you call him. Is he a college professor going for a doctorate, a JD, remember, Joe? And he just rambled. And this is a man that teaches people in college. And he even questioned the landing on the moon at the end. I mean, I don't know. It's getting scary, I think.
I got a text over the weekend from someone asking if I looked into the cult of the serpent, and I didn't even know what that one was.
I think that was wasn't that the bad guy from the first Conan the Barbarian movie?
Well, then I have looked into it.
Played by James Earl Jones.
Because that was an excellent movie.
Wow, so good.
No, it's Hillary's new boyfriend.
Cult of the Serpent.
Oh, I'm terrible. Well, what can I say? Yeah, look it up. It's been a great interview, and I appreciate you coming on and talking to us and letting the listeners know the psychology behind some of these conspiracies.
Oh, yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. It's been a good time.